Hello, welcome to Collective Conscious, episode 4 out of infinity. Yep, we're sticking with the infinity. Today, we are talking about something called the deathbed fallacy. So I'm going to hop right over to Junwei. How about you give us a quick definition of the deathbed fallacy so everyone is on the same page, and then share your initial thoughts on it?
Sure. So this is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while because the deathbed fallacy isn't really like an established fallacy in the grand scheme of things. Like it was posted by pretty sure a user from medium.com. So like pretty much just a random person created this fallacy, and it's not on Stanford Encyclopedia or Wikipedia. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting idea and a life applicable thing to discuss. So what is the fallacy? So, in general, people, you always hear people on their deathbeds, or if you talk to loved ones or relatives, and, they tell you that, oh man, like, this is what I regret in life. Like, you know, when you get to this age, like, you're gonna feel the same regret. So maybe you should try to do this thing earlier so you don't have as many regrets as I do. Um, and the fallacy is that people on their deathbed know exactly how you should live your life right now. They wish they would have done things differently, meaning they think you should do something differently right now. And what the author argues is that you should consider yourself over a lifetime, not as a single person, but rather a line of many people with different views and priorities. And he gives three reasons why the deathbed is not a reliable advisor. The first reason is that it is not a representative state. And what he means by that is, you're on your deathbed and you have, I don't know, week, 2, 1 month tops to live, and you're about to die, which is a very unique place in life to be in, approaching death. So that's the first reason he gives, is that it's not a representative state, and we shouldn't give too much weight in that. Um, the second reason is you don't know your past selves, but you think you do. And I guess what he means by that is, people change differently over time, and your past self isn't necessarily uh, indicative of what your present self is. And the last reason he gives why deathbed is not a reliable advisor is that most people that die today live in a world very different from yours. So, uh, you know, we see this in society with the age of technology, and that correlates to, like, making friends, would making friends be easier with technology or not. And so it's the basic premise that people live different lives in different centuries and etc. um, so that was the main author's argument. And my initial thought on that is that he honestly presents a very compelling argument, and I tend to agree with him. And I want to give a brief context to, the most common regrets people give, because I feel like that's very relevant. And one of the most common regrets is that I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And I found this regret very funny for this episode, in regard to the deathbed fallacy, because just think about what it says. It's saying, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expect of me. That's the most common regret of all. And if you think about that statement, like, isn't that kind of saying that you should just, like, deathbed regrets shouldn't just be a thing? If you really want to live a life true to myself, why should you listen to uh it's kind of like meta, right? Like, you shouldn't listen to people's deathbed regrets if you want to live a life true to yourself. So I found that was kind of funny. Anyway, my going on to my initial thoughts. My initial pushback, I guess, in his argument is that, um, he's saying that you shouldn't listen to people on their deathbed because they don't have a future at all. They're about to die, and nothing they think has a bearing on their future. All they have is the present and memories. On the other hand, I would want to at least initially argue the opposite, in that this, in fact, is precisely why someone on their deathbed is worth listening to. The person on their deathbed have nothing to lose. Like, they have, no dog in the race and no ulterior motives or reasons not to tell you the truth. Like, I would
Exactly.
imagine, yeah, I would imagine my grandparents, or, you can just list think of your close relatives, and they want the best for you. They really do. Like, they love you, and so why wouldn't they tell you the truth and how to live your best life? And so those are my initial thoughts. How about you, Tyler?
So I think there is sort of you said how one person is really a collection of many people over the course of their life, and I absolutely agree with that. The person you are is constantly a changing state. I'm not the same person I was when this podcast started. You've already changed my life, obviously. So I would say that that's important to know, but at the same time, I think something that the author, either intentionally or unintentionally, I'm not really sure, kind of does is treat, just because the person that you are, your sort of identity, is a collection of different people, doesn't mean that they all exist simultaneously, ignoring debates about philosophy of time. I'm not going to get into that part. Maybe we'll do that in another episode. But just because the person that you are on your deathbed is a different person doesn't mean that you can, I mean, everybody knows this intuitively. You can't just talk to them right now about what they want. And so, of course, it's impossible to know exactly what the person who's going to be on your deathbed wants for you right now. I think that's one of the key sort of hurdles. However, in the more general problem statement of whether you should be living in order to minimize your regrets on your deathbed, to me, I was a math major, as you know, Junwei. So I tend to view things mathematically. And when I was thinking about this problem, I sort of reframed it as I thought about it more as, if you are just trying to minimize the number of regrets for the person that you are on your deathbed, let's say, essentially what you're doing is making decisions to optimize your life's, let's say, value. Let's just say value is some sort of mathematical function. You're making decisions to optimize or maximize that function's value at only one specific point in time, which is the very last point in time, or the segment at the very end of the time length of your life. So to an extent, it kind of makes sense. But when I started thinking about the problem that way, in terms of thinking of, let's just call it a value function as a function of time, which just takes in all the decisions you're making, it doesn't make sense to just optimize that for one very limited point of values. What it seems to me what you should be doing is trying to optimize it for the collection of all points in the future. However, this is sort of where my initial thoughts end, is the uncertainty of what the value of that function will be for a decision you make right now rapidly increases as you look further down the timeline. And what I mean by that is, a decision you make right now, you can estimate pretty accurately what the impacts are going to be in the short term, maybe even in the medium term, just depending on the decision. But in the long term, it's incredibly uncertain. And so trying to chase that outcome with such a high level of uncertainty surrounding it almost seems like a pointless endeavor in the first place, statistically speaking. So that's about how I'm thinking about it.
I'm really glad you brought up the math analogy, because that kind of exactly aligns with what I think about listening to people on their deathbed. I know I had that pushback argument initially, trying to play devil's advocate, but I think my true thoughts on that is exactly what you said, is that you're spending a week, I said a week or two or a month tops on your deathbed. Like, if you're just optimizing for that 1 month, I don't think that's worth it. And this is a quote I found that's really, like, it really settled with me to how I felt about it, is that this is by Dana Miller, is that you're going to spend 1 day of your life on your deathbed. The other 25,000 are the ones we should be worrying about. Go to bed happy tonight. And I feel like that quote really sums up what I think about this argument. And I try to think about it this way too. Like, yeah, sure, I don't want to be regretful on my deathbed. Like, who likes regret? But is it really worth shaping my life around how I want to feel during 1 or 2 miserable days at the very end of my life? And I think in general, no matter how complete of a life you will live, generally speaking, the average human is going to have regrets. Like, maybe like monks or like people who are very devoted to like spirituality are exceptions to that rule. But in general, I think no matter what, people will have regrets when they're about to die. And just like a kind of anecdotal example, in college, like, you know, I really like partying in college. I like going out. I like having fun with friends, and I felt like I did a pretty good job in doing that. Like I tried to optimize most weeks to do that kind of to those to party. Man,
You
to this day,
animal.
and to this day, I still regret not going out more, even though I like went out more than I expected
My God,
I
you
would.
absolute animal. I thought that was about to go the other way around.
Oh no. But I was like, yeah, like no matter what, like I still regret not spending more time with friends in college. Like I feel like no matter how much time I spent with friends in college, I'm still gonna regret not spending more. So applying that to like this deathbed fallacy, like no matter how complete a life I'm gonna live, I'm gonna have still like a few regrets, and that's just unavoidable.
Yeah, let me lay out a quick proof that no matter what, you will have some sort of regret. Um, it's based on the assumption, though, that the person you are is changing. It's very quick. Um, if the person you are is changing, then your preferences are changing. Therefore, your preferences for the outcomes of your decisions are changing. Therefore, there are some decisions that you've made where you will prefer the outcome of the decision you made at some points in your life, and you will prefer the outcome of the decision you did not make at other points in your life. So at some stage in your life, you always have some sort of regret. And that's an argument that I didn't come into this prepared with that. I just thought of that while you were talking. But it I think it sort of reinforces your point that there's no point of trying to live so that you won't have any regrets. It just doesn't make any sense. I think it's about just overall regret minimization is sort of to put it back into mathematical terms very quickly, it's a bad target function to try to optimize. I think there are better ones, and I think we partly talked about that in our first episode too, about happiness. There are there are greater things to strive for than minimizing your number of regrets.
Right. And I think even the broader idea is that like there's like this kind of assumption that you can make the perfect choice all the time. Like it sounds really easy to like, I mean, deathbed regrets are kind of correlated with happiness research, which is pretty good, I guess. But it assumes that you can like just take that advice from people and be like, oh, now I'm not gonna have regrets and on my deathbed now just because I just know, like, just knowing is not gonna get you very far. Like you actually really have to implement them, and when you actually implement them, it doesn't mean it's gonna have like a good impact on your life. And so like I think it's fairly naive to say that like you can make the perfect choice all the time because it's literally impossible. Because like almost by definition, experience requires failure, and experience helps you make better decisions. So the most successful people generally have made more mistakes and learned from them, which is, if you learn from them, that's a very important distinction, than others who aren't as successful. And I feel like there's a line drawn, for most people as to how much mistake versus success they're willing to accept, and that boils down to individual choice. But essentially, people should be taught more to not fear mistakes, as it's a driving force for becoming a better person overall.
Yeah, so do you feel like most people's regrets would be driven by them doing the wrong thing? Because the way I'm thinking about it actually is that I think most of my regrets more come from inaction than wrongful action. What about you?
Um, I mean, I would agree with what you're saying. Like in general, I think regrets is more of I wish I did this more, and not so much of, oh, I did this, I regret doing that. And I feel like that's just a basic. I can't really think of right now the psychological reason why humans tend to view regret that way, but I definitely agree that like inaction is more of a regret in human lives than action.
Yeah, well, as humans, in a general sense, we're wired toward risk minimization just from evolutionary reasons. So to me, it makes sense that people make decisions to not do something that they see as risky and then regret it later because they know what the outcome would have been. But the truth is, at the time you're making the decision, you actually don't know what the outcome is. So the person that regrets it later, is not only a different person just from the sense that everybody's changing, but also in the sense that they have more information about that decision. It's like if someone bets all their money on some garbage stock, right? And then it happens to shoot through the roof and they become, I don't know, a billionaire. Obviously that's a pretty extreme example. I don't know. Maybe that's how George Soros got so rich. Anyways, um, I think he was a little smarter than that. Moving on. That doesn't make it a good decision necessarily because you didn't have that information at the time you made the decision. And this example is sort of the opposite of what we're talking about with regrets, but I think it illustrates it better. Is that just because you happen to get lucky doesn't mean it was necessarily a good decision. I think you can look at regret the same way where in some sense, just because you didn't do something doesn't mean that doing it was necessarily the right decision just because you know what the outcome happened to be. Like if there was only a 1% chance that the outcome turned out well and you decided to go with the 99% side, I don't know if you can necessarily call that a bad decision. It's not like you're aware more of the odds at that time than you are of the actual outcome. So I think some regrets may be a little bit unfounded just because of the, I don't know if you could really call it a fallacy, but the difference in information that you have at different points in your life.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that, without getting into free will and determinism, which we can say for it is in its own episode, um, I think it's you just can't make the right decision uh in the present, like no matter what you do. And so I think my initial kind of like acceptance of this fallacy and that like how to really get over regret and later in life is that you just have to make the best decisions you can. I mean, life is just, yeah, again, without getting into free will determinism, it is a chance game. And so I think in the present, all you can do is really make the best decision you can at any given point in time, given the information you have. And if you do make a wrong decision, you try to undo it the best you can, like damage control. And if you can't, make the new best life you can, given that decision's quote unquote consequences. Um, and I feel like every now and then, even though humans are risk averse, as you said, um, every now and then you can take a bit of risk too, because I think that's fine.
It's like Russell Westbrook shooting game-winning threes. It's always a bad decision, but there are times when it works out and it's hype.
The one time he makes it, it's all worth it.
Yeah, because then it goes on YouTube and gets viewed like a billion times by people, and they say like, "Oh, Westbrook's the most clutch." Not that I don't love Westbrook, for the record, he's one of my favorite players, but it's in line with what we're talking about to a certain degree. So I want to shift a little bit and go back a tiny bit to what I was saying earlier, and sort of restate this fallacy in the first place in slightly different terms and more general terms. So the way I stated what the fallacy or the thought experiment, whatever you want to call it, is, was that people were trying to optimize that function for a very small selection of its domain. And of course, it's up to opinion whether that's a good decision or not. Personally, don't think that's probably the best way to go about making decisions. But I think a more general way to state the problem as a whole would be to say, okay, over which time period are you trying to optimize that function? Not just are you trying to optimize it for the very end or not, but how do you choose a time period over which to optimize it? Because at this point, we've basically said, all right, don't just live for your deathbed. All right, that's fine. What do you live for? That's a more important question. We haven't actually proposed an alternative yet, so I want to do that. And let me just give you my thinking on this real quick, and then we can discuss it. My thinking is that, and I'm going to go back to the uncertainty thing, a decision you make right now, you have a very, very accurate idea of what the impacts are going to be in the next second, and the second after that, and probably a good amount of seconds, minutes, maybe hours, possibly days, weeks, months, depending on the decision again, after that. But objectively speaking, as the time period from which you made the decision increases, the uncertainty increases as well. It's always getting bigger. And it seems to me that the sort of sweet spot for when we have enough information about the impacts of what we're doing, and it's not too short-sighted so that we can't even, have an effective future and we're just trapping ourselves in a box, is a time range of around 3 to 5 years for the most part. So that would be my sort of proposal to most people, is try to make decisions that are optimizing your life consistently. I'll just say 1 to 5 years in the future. So you're still doing stuff for yourself in the short term, but you're not screwing yourself over. And at the same time, you're not falling into that trap of trying to make decisions for that time very far down the road where you actually have no idea what the impacts of the decisions you're making are. So I'm curious what you think about that, and if you would propose a different time length personally.
Yeah, I mean, my only question for you is like, I'm sure the 1 to 5 years is probably pretty just arbitrary. Like you can say probably 2 to 6 or 3 to 6, and you probably wouldn't be too against that.
Yeah, it's
And
absolutely arbitrary.
okay, I mean, I agree that like that's a pretty good optimization in terms of like compromising. Like you can't you can make uncertainty goes up as time goes up, and you certainly don't want to optimize for your last 2 weeks of your life. So how do you want to optimize is the premise here. And I suppose that thinking of your life short term, and and then this is the assumption that your general life expectancy is like around 80 something years in Western countries, third world country, first world countries, and
Mhm.
that 1 to 5 years is just a pretty good like indicator in terms of like setting goals and that kind of thing. I mean, it does vary on 1 to 5 years is like really big when you're like going from like 15 to 20, and then like if you're like 45 to 50, that's like the impact is like I would say the impact from 15 to 20 is way more than like 45 to 50. So you have to factor that into account. But in general, like if you want to just set goals and think of your life like more of like in the next 5 years, I want to do this rather than like in like 60 years, I don't want to have this regret. I think that's a pretty good approach to take.
Yeah, I think one other sort of justification for it is that if you're chasing this 20-year goal and that's your main goal, it's a lot more inflexible than if you're chasing slightly shorter term goals. So, like if you're trying to become a doctor and then, you fail a few classes, all of a sudden you can't become a doctor, your life has just collapsed a lot more than if your goals are much more short term, because you can change around those much more rapidly and effectively than something very rigid and long term.
Yeah, it seems like for something like becoming a doctor, and that's like a pretty long-term goal in terms of like, undergrad, med school and residency and whatever else you need to become a doctor. Um, that kind of goal, if it does fail eventually and you reach all the way to the end and somehow it doesn't work out, uh, I guess it would feel worse that you wasted that much more time of your life than like if you just plan more for the present and like the next, say like next 1 to 2 years and see where you are in that, and then like make your decisions like year by year rather than like every 5 years.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we're continuously making decisions, so it's not like you have to go in discrete 5-year segments by any means. I agree. But yeah, I wanted to pose the problem in that way because I think it's a little more helpful to pose it in that way than to just pose like the binary deathbed or not deathbed version of it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically like you're saying is to think of your life in terms of not one interval but like several intervals.
Hmm. And then choosing the appropriate time to try to optimize it, like not just the appropriate time, but the appropriate time from now, from wherever you are currently. So, like, if just to be clear, what I'm saying is right now, what I'm trying to do is make decisions that optimize my life in 1 to 5 or 3 to 5 years from now. But a year from now, that's not going to be 0 to 4 or 2 to 4. It's still going to be 1 to 5 or 3 to 5 from then.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any disagreement about sort of how far out we should be trying to optimize, or if we just should only focus on short term or only focus on long term or anything like that?
That's a good question. I think my initial answer comes down to where you are in life, because I feel like your initial years from like 0 to like, let's say like 30 is much more impactful in terms of like changes in your life than 30 to 60. Like if you just generally speaking, if you
Yeah, that's
think of
fair.
humans as a whole in Western society, at least, like think about how many changes you make from 0 to 30 than like 30 to 60. Again, I haven't lived, I'm not 30, but like I would imagine that 30 to 60 is a much more consistent time period in someone's life than 0 to 30. So I feel like I'm curious to see what your thoughts on like distinguishing between like that first half and then the second half of your life in terms of like how many changes you're going to expect it to make and how that affects your suggestion.
Yeah, let me throw another basketball analogy at you that I thought of while you were saying that. All right, so 82 game season, right? Let's assume that each game is the year of your life, that the points you score are like the value that you're creating in some sense, however you want to define that personally. Basically, the function that you'd be trying to optimize by making decisions. It's a lot easier to change your season like average points per game in the first 20 games of the season than it is in the last 20 games of the season, because everything you're doing is consistently being aggregated. You can't go back. So I agree with you that the decisions you make earlier in life are in a sense more impactful because proportionally they have a much higher impact on that overall value. But that's a little dismal at the same time because of course we can't go back. I mean, for someone who's 70 that would be listening to this, you know, if that's ever going to happen, um, it's a little maybe depressing to think of it that way. But at the same time, you're always the youngest that you're ever going to be. So you're always, by that logic, making some of the most important decisions you're ever going to make. So maybe that's the optimistic other side of it.
It seems like that way, and I want to propose a different alternative to this deathbed regret thing, and this goes in more of like therapeutic research and like just emotions, as you know, human emotion, but like the practice of like acceptance, and that like you can't be perfect in life and you're going to have regret, and like it's okay to have regret. Like I'm wondering, like I haven't been in a deathbed or really talked to someone who's been in a deathbed, so I don't have first or second hand experience with this. But I would imagine that most old people, it could be a stereotype, but like they're pretty content with their life. Like there's some exceptions, sure, but in general, um, people who are about to die and they lived like not a, I can't say a complete life, but you know their life expectancy, like they didn't die like at 30 or like 50, like you know they lived a
Right.
complete life in that sense, and I feel
Mhm.
like they have like this sense of calmness and peace in a way, and they're like most people are like ready to go, like they've accepted that fact. So I'm curious to really like where these regrets come from. Like are these just like people who like truly regret it and they're like crying out, or they're just like, oh yeah, these are just things I regret, maybe I would have been happier, but it's not a big deal at the end of the day.
Well, I can say anecdotally, I agree that it seems that a lot of people who are very close to the end of their life do seem to have a sense of calmness and acceptance. Maybe I envy that to a certain degree, but we do have a much different perspective than a lot of people because we're both relatively young, both in our early 20s. So maybe we do have a completely different perspective on regrets as a whole, just because of the fact that we're young. So it's hard to say though. You know, I don't know any studies or research that have looked into people's um, how much they're at peace with the end of their life when they're older compared to people when they're younger. But I can say, like I said, that I have noticed that people do seem to have a sense of calmness. So maybe there's nothing to worry about in the end.
Maybe, let's hope so. I want to just, we have some time left here, and I'm curious on what you think about the author's suggestion, which is like, you know, his proposal, his alternative is that, you know, don't bother with the deathbed fallacy and instead look at happiness research. And he's saying like, you know, that tells you to focus on having a stable income, focus on maintaining good relationships, and having experiences rather than things, practicing acceptance, and really other small things like commute time and just like happiness research in general. So, what do you think of that as an alternative to the deathbed regret?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, part of that goes back to our first episode and talking about happiness as a concept. But with the overall idea of that suggestion, I agree with focusing on the happiness throughout your life rather than the regrets or lack thereof at the end of your life. That makes sense. Goes back to what I was saying with, looking at many time frames rather than just one at the end. But whether or not it's happiness you look at, that's a separate debate.
Right.
But the idea of his suggestion, I do agree with.
Do you have any closing thoughts on this topic?
Overall, I think my closing thoughts would just be focus on many people that you're going to be, not just one person that you're going to be. And even though I think 1 to 5 years or 3 to 5 years is a good choice, doesn't have to be everyone's choice by any means. I just don't think that people should only focus on one specific time period in their life. Focus on a lot of different time periods, or at least a more expansive one. That would be my closing remarks or advice.
Gotcha. And how like, out of curiosity, how risk averse do you think people should be? Like, even though humans are naturally inclined to be risk averse, like, is there any thought to like really, how do you like optimize risk in your scenario?
That's a great question. That is a very not couple sentence answer question. I think it comes down to never ignoring risk, because that's stupid. Like, people say that entrepreneurs are just risk takers. Well, in a sense, that's true, but it's not really true. It's just that a calculated risk is much different than a risk, just taking a risk, not knowing what the risk actually is. Um, so the first part would be to actually try to understand the risk that you are taking, not just being aware that you may be taking a risk. And then the second part is to accept that and go ahead with it if it's something that's important to you. If it's not important, then there's really no point in taking the risk. I think that's self-evident. Probably don't need to tell anyone that, hopefully. But if it's something important, there's no reason to always be minimizing risk. That's just foolish. No investor would make profits if they were just consistently minimizing risk, or, well, they wouldn't make substantial profits. But being aware of the risk that you're taking is more important, in my opinion. And there's a distinction there between taking a risk you understand and just taking a risk.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can get on board with that, and perhaps we can talk about risk in its own episode, because it might actually deserve its own episode.
I can flex my quantitative finance knowledge on you. All right. So do you have any closing thoughts of your own?
Yeah, my closing thoughts is, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but um, you live your life in the present, and you shouldn't live it for, well, you should live it for the past in terms of like how you should improve on your past, but you definitely shouldn't live it like that far down the line in the future in terms of like, the extremes, like the deathbed. Like, if you're on deathbed, like, maybe you can think of life as like, if I died right now, what would I regret? And like, use that as a thought experiment and like see, if you died right now, what would you regret in life? I can see how that can be helpful and unhelpful, but at least it can give you a sense of like what will make me happier. And I feel like if you focus on those things, it might actually um, be a boost to your happiness, perhaps, or just try new experiences in that regard.
I think that's a nice way to wrap it up. So this has been Junwei and Tyler with Collective Conscious, episode 4. Thanks for listening. See you guys next time.